Welcome to the Keen On Show. I am not Andrew Keen. My name is Jonathan Rauch. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I'm a writer, a journalist. I am also a former guest several times on Andrew's show, and I'm a member of his audience. In fact, I'd say I listen to the majority of the podcasts that Andrew puts out. I am here guest hosting today with a special guest of my own, and I will give you the background. Andrew Keen is one of the most talented questioners in the country. He's also a contrarian, a curmudgeon, a critic, and a skeptic. And as a result of those things, he is hard to pin down. His opinions come out in the interstices in the way he asks questions and in his often skeptical replies, but he'll skip on to the next question before you can really pin him down on what he thinks. And I said to him last time I was on the show, okay, Andrew, enough of that. Let's turn the tables. So my special guest today is the one and only Andrew Keen. And today I am the interviewer. I am not going to let him slide away from questions and into questions of his own. We are going to pin down Andrew on some areas where he and I have maybe some disagreements, or at least some differences of emphasis, or at least things that I want to know all about. Welcome, Andrew, to the Keen On Show.
Thank you. And John, you've just revealed your biggest fantasy, pinning me down.
We won't go there, but yes, absolutely. Actually, my biggest fantasy is having your hair instead of mine, but we won't go there either. In San Francisco, how are people thinking about the election? Is it gnashing of teeth and wailing and stripping of garments out there?
Well, I don't mean to be elusive, John, but I have no idea. Our street is having its annual Christmas festivities on December 6th. I think this interview will go out before then. So I have to admit, I didn't really spend a lot of time I've spent a lot of time thinking and obviously talking about it and following it. But on election night, I watched about 15 minutes of CNN. It was clear who was going to win. I switched it off. My wife and I haven't discussed it really very much. I'm not sure. I think she suspects I'm a Trump supporter, so she doesn't talk to me about it. She tries to pin me down on other things. My kids don't seem to be particularly interested. And I don't actually know that many. I mean, I know people on my street. I've always been irritated by these white male haters of Trump. They always get on my nerves, especially the liberals. But yeah, maybe they have a point. But I have no idea. I mean, I don't think most people in San Francisco really care one way or the other. I also don't think it will make any difference to San Francisco. San Francisco, I know you want to talk about this, has lots of problems of its own. It had problems of its own, challenges and opportunities under any kind of administration, whether it's Harris, Trump, Biden, Obama. It doesn't seem to make any difference. The city has its own logic and narrative. So I actually have no idea. I haven't been. I mean, I know I don't want to turn the tables. I know you're the interviewer on this one, but my sense is that, I mean, DC is obviously a political town. My sense is that most of the country is much less interested in politics in this election than DC. I think that
there is this time
a trauma there, but I don't think the rest of the country cares that much.
You know, even in DC, there's more of a sense of resignation than there was in 2016, and we'll see what it brings. We've been through a lot of this before, but so I want to get into this a bit because this is an area of maybe disagreement or maybe difference in emphasis, but a theme of yours over the Trump era and especially the election period, at least I would say this is a theme of yours. You may disagree. Is what I would say the of course but kind of approach to Trump, which is kind of, well, of course he may have done criminal things, and of course he is not very smart, and of course he has some bad ideas, and of course this, and of course that, but don't hyperventilate. He's a bit of a clown. He doesn't have the attention span. We've been through this before. He isn't Hitler. Everybody calm down. An attitude toward Trump, which tends to be skeptical of your guests like me who've said, no, Andrew, this guy's the real deal. He may not be Hitler. You're right to reject those comparisons, but he does look a lot like Orban, or like Le Pen, or like Erdogan. He does have strong authoritarian tendencies, and he knows what he's doing. And I wrote an article in The Atlantic, I think we've talked about it, in August of 2022, predicting the 6 things that he would do if he got into office, and that they're very, very dangerous things. They would transform our democracy
Right.
in some ways.
I don't want to
And
speak
so
into
far,
you, but it's Trump's second term. What a Trump's second term would look like? You wrote a couple of years ago in 2022 in the
yep,
Atlantic.
yep, that's the one. 6 things, he's already done or doing 5 of them. The 6th is ignoring court orders, which I predict he will do. So, do you still think you're right to have a kind of, boys will be boys attitude toward Trump, or am I being unfair to you?
Well, I definitely. I don't know what you mean by when you mean boys will be boys.
Well, sort of, he's a bad guy, but we'll get through it. Everybody calm down.
Yeah, I would redefine that. I mean, my own feeling, since you're trying to pin me down here, is that, and I like to, and I got my own quote here from Gramsci, one of the great quotes I think about anything. He wrote, I think, from his prison diaries in the 20s. He wrote, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time for monsters." And I think that sums up this Trump period. Trump is, in a Gramscian sense, a monster, both in reality and the way he's perceived, particularly amongst progressives. I mean, I would say politically, I would position myself certainly to the left of you. You're about the most centrist person. I mean that in a complimentary way that I know. My own opinion on this is that America, I mean, countries are always in the process of change. I mean, that's almost it goes without saying. No country ever stays the same. I mean, remember the famous quote in the Lampedusa's Leopard, another great Italian book, in which he suggests the only way to stay the same is to change. But America is in a particularly historic moment where it's I'm trying to write a book about America, trying to sort of shift or reinvent its operating system. The old industrial operating system doesn't work. The New Deal operating system, the 20th century operating system, not just the New Deal system, but the neoliberal system that replaced the New Deal system at the end of the 20th century. Those things don't work. So I see Trump as a symptom of these changes. And I also see the Democratic Party, which for me is much more interesting actually than the Republican Party. I'm less interested in Trump, more interested in Harris, as symptomatic of the way in which progressives have been entirely clueless in this situation. And they've become the conservatives. They've become the defenders of the status quo. So for me, that's perhaps more interesting than Trump. In my opinion of Trump is he's actually, especially in these appointments, I think he's trying in his own disorganized, narcissistic way to actually address some of the fundamental issues in America, like its dysfunctional healthcare system, like its dysfunctional immigration system. I'm sure he'll fail or it'll degenerate into soap opera reality television farce. But I think Trump acknowledges American reality more than Harris, which is why he won the election. So for me, the fact that, and I thought Trump would win. I wasn't one of the few people, but I made it very clear throughout the show that I always thought he was going to win. And the reason I thought he was going to win is because I have a kind of almost a weirdly, a sort of surreally Hegelian way of trying to figure out the future by working back narratives. It would have made no sense for Harris to have won because Biden won identically to the way Harris wanted to win. And that isn't how history works, particularly in America, where things are always changing. And all the issues that Trump wants to deal with in his own bizarre, way, need to be addressed. One other thing that let me be really clear. This idea, you compare Trump, you literally compare Trump to Orban, Erdogan, and Le Pen. So firstly, Le Pen isn't in power, so I don't know what the comparison is there. And Le Pen is an entirely different kind of character, and the French political system is entirely incomparable to the American system. Erdogan is entirely different. The Turkish system has never been a particularly viable democracy at the best of times. It's barely been a democracy. And this Hungarian comparison is also absurd. Hungary has a very young democracy. It's a tiny, irrelevant country. It gets fetishized by conservatives as some sort of model to impose on America, in the same way as it gets fetishized and Orban gets fetishized by the left, suggesting, oh, we're going to become like Hungary. It's just an absurd comparison. They're entirely different countries, entirely different political systems, entirely different neighborhoods of the world. So I just think those comparisons are pointless and only bring out people's hysteria, both on the left and the right.
Well, so let's grant, for purposes of argument, I disagree, actually. I think that these movements are learning from each other, have a lot in common in terms of the techniques. Of course, the political systems are very different, but there are also similarities, and we shouldn't overlook those. Reference there to Anne Applebaum and her work. But setting all that aside,
can I just jump in here also? I think Anne Applebaum is a cold warrior of a, in some ways, a disreputable type. I've dealt with her over the years. I'm particularly troubled by this sort of Applebaumian, if that's the right word, this new kind of Cold War and this idea of I'm particularly troubled. But anyway, maybe we can get to that later.
Yes. Let's stipulate to what you just said about the foreign comparisons. Let's let Trump be Trump, and that's probably actually the better way to proceed anyway. But let me clarify where you're going with this, because it's a powerful idea. This idea that you've mentioned, that we're in at times are not able to grapple with for all kinds of different reasons. Do you think that it's a good thing then that Trump and the Republicans will be in power for 4 years, 2 of those 4 years with the Republican Congress? Do you see that as, in its own perhaps unusual way, a kind of progress towards something good? Or do you see it more as a misbegotten adventure, a misinterpretation of efforts to try to move beyond neoliberalism? A bad thing, in other words, or at least a not good thing?
Well, I'm not sure good and bad things I necessarily think in that way. I think historically. So for me, it's a necessary thing. It's like going to the doctor, right? You may not want to go to the doctor, but if you've got something wrong with you, you need to go and you need to address it. The Kamala Harris model was to ignore the illness and pretend as if everything was fine. It was a bigger lie, in my view, than the Trump lie. We know about Trump's lying. We know about his consummate lying. But the Democratic Party is also in the business of lying, of denying reality, of not acknowledging the deep structural problems and changes and challenges. So in that way, there are people in the Democratic Party, particularly Bernie Sanders, who address it. And I'm not entirely convinced by everything he says, but I definitely think he's more of a truth teller than Harris. And I think, yes, in the same way, and I'm not a Leninist, but in the same way as Lenin celebrated World War I, recognizing it would bring about the crisis, and I'm not suggesting that we are I hope we're not on the verge of another great, terrible war like the War of 1914. But history has to happen, John. I mean, all you think tank wonks in DC, the Brookings, I don't want to group you. You're much smarter than a lot of them. But these wonks who seem to think that everything that America can be operated off their iPhone and that everything's right and all you need to do is have a few policy changes and Biden was a good president and there's nothing wrong with America, and the way that Harris presented this lie of America at the convention is just absurd. So yes, I think it's not a good, I don't celebrate the Trump victory. But what I do celebrate are these experiments that I probably hope will fail, but at the same time have to be addressed, like healthcare, for example, this dysfunctional system where there's this kind of private enterprise monopoly where doctors can charge you anything they want. And no one has any idea of where the costs or the prices come from, but they pay it and everyone gets ripped off. Or the university system, where again, where people are overcharged and it's not entirely clear what you're getting. There's so much that needs to be changed. I'm not celebrating Trump's assault on universities. I'll be intrigued to see what RFK does with the healthcare system. I'm sure it will be another farce, but at least he's beginning to address these things. It's the same with immigration. You can't have a country where, whatever it is, I don't know what the numbers are, it's not my expertise, but whatever it is, 5, 10, 15 million people are living in a country illegally. It's just ridiculous. It's absurd, especially given the challenges. I know as an immigrant myself, you have to write out forms and get a green card and all the rest of it. It's just an absurd situation. So all the stuff that, I mean, some of the stuff, I mean, obviously Trump lies mostly and makes enormous amounts of stuff up and is a very ugly, vulgar man. But the stuff that he raises, the issues of immigration, healthcare, the universities, the class system, globalization, these are all real. And to just sweep it all under the carpet and argue that Trump's deluded and that we could just go back to Uncle Joe Biden and everything was fine is a bigger lie, in my view.
You've seen perhaps David Brooks's Atlantic cover story, which I think I pointed out to you.
Yeah, I mean, he's another example to me. I've got the Atlantic cover, and the Atlantic isn't interesting. I know you're a writer for the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, Brooks, in a different way, sort of epitomizes the rottenness of the American high-end intellectual business. That here's a guy who gets produced by the very meritocracy that he's now trying to pull down. But anyway, go on.
Well, I just raise it because I think in his own way, he's trying to get at something like what you're getting at, which is that we've constructed a system that just ignores the large number of people who are poorly served by it, and that it's become smug and complacent, and it's a bunch of people generating outcomes that serve people like themselves. And he wants to redefine the whole idea of merit. I'm not sure how he's going to do that. I don't think he knows how he's going to do that. But I just wanted to point it out as perhaps a sign that there are people in the establishment who are reaching toward the kind of view that you're reaching toward.
Yeah, although I again, I don't like the work of Brooks. I don't have a great deal of respect for him. I think he's an intellectual opportunist, and I think his life and his work are in contradiction.
Well, the frustration that we have with views like yours at places at the Brookings Institution, which would very much qualify as being the establishment, you know, the belly of the beast of the policy establishment.
Yeah, ground zero.
Ground zero. Yeah, I am right there, and I cheerfully admit it. And yes, we have a strong status quo bias, but the reason for that is that we think that's the way the founders intended the system to work, that they were allergic to revolutions, to shaking the whole thing up overnight. Jefferson proposed that, but Madison and the others were against it. And we also think that policy is really difficult, and you can do a ton of damage if you're not careful, especially with the office of the presidency. And I worry about, you know, granting that there's a historical truth in what you said that's important, and that sitting here and being smug is not the answer. It is also the case that if someone comes along, makes big promises to fix healthcare and the class system and whatnot, and makes everything worse, the public will become even more angry and more cynical, and we will further drive ourselves into the spiral of discontent that we're experiencing now. So I come down on the side of caution. It sounds
well. I think that's another cultural feature. I mean, I don't want to lump you in with the Harris people, but I mean, America is built on risk. So your reading of the founders as these deeply conservative figures, I think, is wrong. I mean, they were revolutionaries, and okay, they didn't want perpetual revolution. They weren't Trotsky. And I mean, and Jefferson talked about what was that famous quote about renewing the blood or
The blood of patriots every
yeah.
20
So
years. Yeah.
although he was, I mean, he was a core founder and profoundly involved in the founding of the country. I mean, he left. I was just in DC a couple of weeks ago. I mean, his statues everywhere on the Mall. I mean, he has more visibility to Jefferson than there is to anyone except Lincoln. Certainly more than our friend Madison, who I mean, you and I agree. I mean, I'm a great fan of Madison. I'm not as familiar. I'm not as educated on Madison as you are, but my reading of the Federalist Papers is not that it's a conservative document, that it's not built on a fear of change. It just recognizes the reality of faction, and that you have a political system designed to make sure that faction doesn't degenerate into civil war. And it's also designed to as a defense against direct democracy, which he was very fearful of because of his reading of history and his fear that America could degenerate into what it seems to be becoming now, which is a plebiscitary authoritarian direct democracy. So I can't remember what was the question. Yeah,
Well,
but let me come back. I think there is, in some ways, I mean, America is this weird country where, on the one hand, things have changed so dramatic. I'm talking to you from San Francisco, from the edge of Silicon Valley, where things have changed just unimaginably. I mean, I wrote a book, Cult of the Amateur, back in 2007. I did another show on this where I had another guest interview, and we were talking about how the tech world's changed. I mean, 20 years ago, there was there was barely an internet. 20 years ago, AI was a joke. 20 years ago, Musk was just another character in a Silicon Valley soap opera. Everything has changed so dramatically. But on the other hand, America stood still. On the other hand, all the problems associated with, I keep on bringing up medical, education, the class system, inequality, the impact of globalization, all these things are just exactly the same. So America is this, I don't know what you would call it, almost a bipolar country where on the one hand, it changes too much, completely out of control, in probably in the way it has historically. And on the other hand, it's just stuck in this perpetual present of
I'm inclined to say,
dysfunctionality.
I
I mean,
think
and
that's
San
true, but I'm
Francisco's like that, where on the one hand, it's on the verge of Silicon Valley and some of the richest and most dynamic people live here. And on the other hand, it's stuck with all the problems of homelessness and all the other issues. So, but I am a critic of the idea that change is dangerous. And the way you presented it, at least of Brookings, I think that has been profoundly damaging to America, that we have now, in some ways, certainly under Biden and under Obama and under people like who's the Pete Buttigieg, this technocratic elite who are averse, who are hostile to any kind of change. And anytime you note change, they'll throw a basket of data at you saying, well, actually, everything's okay. So for me, Buttigieg is another exhibit of the problem that's gone wrong. And of course, he's not just, I don't know if he's got any association with Brookings, but he's an ex-McKinsey guy. And McKinsey is another organization that I think reflects the weird dysfunctionality of America.
I want to go to, I'll come back to San Francisco if we have time. It's you're right, a very interesting case. I think, by the way, what you mentioned, America's split personality between constant change and a certain kind of stability, of conservatism, is a great gift. I think it's a wonderful thing. I want to go to what I think may be a real area of disagreement, perhaps even profound disagreement between us. I think we've surfaced this at the conference on liberalism that we both attended in Washington in July. I wrote an article for Persuasion which basically said 3 tiers for liberalism, why you should feel good about liberalism. I don't say neoliberalism. I'm not sure what that is. I just mean liberalism is the great tradition of the system that is based on freedom of association and speech, rotation in office, individual and minority rights, democracy and elections. The whole system that was created under beginning with John Locke and then on through the Enlightenment and the founders and right up until today. That's what I mean. I am an unabashed supporter of liberalism. I think it is the only system that reliably produces peace, prosperity, freedom, and knowledge. And I think all the people who talk about it's all over for liberalism or neoliberalism, that there are a couple things wrong with that. One is that liberalism has been fantastically successful at doing what it set out to do. A majority of the world's population are now middle class, and another billion with a capital B will become middle class over the course of the decade. And the second thing is,
Yeah, but
I don't
that's.
think
I mean, let's just
I'll
jump
just
in.
I'll just finish and
Okay.
I'll just finish and believe me, you'll have more than adequate time. The second point is more fundamental, and it's the one I would really challenge you on, which is I don't think that people talking about the end of liberalism or neoliberalism have any idea what to replace it with. And the things that they do suggest are just obviously worse. They've been tried and failed, authoritarianism or theocracy or monarchism or communism. So where do you think we're actually going with this idea of post-liberalism?
Well, let me say one thing very clearly. I don't think we're in profound disagreement, John. I'm as much of a liberal as you. I believe. I think we're in complete sync, which is why we get on and why we enjoy these kind of conversations. I think our values are identical. That we want a society where we can say pretty much what we want, as long as in a classic million sense, it doesn't harm others. That we're free to and particularly in a classic liberal sense, we're free to retire from politics if we choose. Like, Trump's coming to power. A lot of people have said, well, I'm going to switch off for the next 4 years. That's what liberalism is. You just don't have to pay attention because it's not going to affect you. I believe in individual right. I mean, that goes without saying. I'm no fan of any alternative to liberalism. So let me say that really clearly, because I don't know what I've said or done to suggest that I'm hostile to liberalism. When have I ever said that people shouldn't have rights to express themselves, or that the state shouldn't be all powerful? I'm as hostile to all the alternatives, whether it's clericism or fascism or communism, as you are. I mean, that kind of almost, I think, goes without saying. So that's the first thing. Secondly, your point on liberalism raising the standard of living around the world is actually, I think, wrong. What's raised, for better or worse, and this is what liberals have to acknowledge, is it's raised. I just finished a very good book. It's just coming out next year. Critics of Capitalism by the John Cassidy of the New Yorker. It's a really interesting book. And he talks, and Branko Milanovic as well talks about the way in which the world has changed, not because of liberalism, but because of the Chinese model, where the vast majority of the people who have been pulled out of poverty over the last 25 years have been East Asians, and particularly Chinese people, who've gone from poverty to some much higher quality standard of living. And in fact, I got a show about this later today with Kishore Mahbubani, who's a defender, I think, of that system, the Singapore Chinese model. So I think you just have to acknowledge that liberals, that's just true. For better or worse, there's an alternative model to the liberal model. It's not fascism, it's not communism, it's not clericism, it's the Chinese model of a strong, and it's certainly not Orban, some clown in East Central Europe in a tiny little country which is basically irrelevant, a rump of the old Habsburg Empire, speak a weird language that no one can understand. The Chinese model is an alternative. It works in China, and it's an attractive model, I think, in much of the developing world. That's what liberalism has to reinvent itself for. Now, where I think you and I might have I don't even know if it's a disagreement, it's almost like a semantic thing, is I think liberalism has to reinvent itself for the 21st century. The 21st century can't reinvent itself for liberalism. It's not as if the world has to recognize that Locke and Mill and Franklin and Madison were right, so we have to reinvent the world. It's obviously an absurd way of thinking. We need to build a 21st century America which reflects and respects the values that you and I share about the value of the state, individual rights. But in this new dynamic world, probably an increasingly technocentric world, a world of AI. I mean, you use this word neoliberalism and liberalism interchangeably. They're entirely different. I mean, you can be a liberal and be hostile to neoliberalism and globalization, which clearly has had a catastrophic impact on the American working class, which has resulted in Trump and Trumpism. The other stats that people like Cassidy and Branko Milanovic pull out of all this is two things have happened. On the one hand, many of the people who in the late 20th century were in poverty in East Asia have been pulled out by the consequences of Chinese, Singaporean authoritarian capitalism. And on the other hand, the other great shift is this impoverishment of the old American working class or middle class, whatever you want to call it. And the challenge then for the America of the 21st century is using the values, the principles that you and I share of Madison, of freedom of expression, of individual rights, of the value of law, but to address all the bigger problems. And it's easy to address to point the problems. I don't have the solution, but at least to acknowledge that this is a crisis, rather than just shoving it all under the carpet and talking about being proud to be Americans and suggesting that it's good enough to be cheerful and anti-Trump and everything will be fine. So I don't think you and I are actually in any profound disagreement on this.
That's actually very clarifying, and I smiled and thumbs up. But that statement I'm going to take away with me is that the 21st century is not going to adapt to liberalism, so it's going to have to be the other way around. I guess what I have trouble with is that those are all very nice words, reinvention and so forth. But I don't think the people who talk that way have any idea what they're really talking about, and that the people who claim to be doing the reinventing, the Stephen Bannons and Stephen Millers of the world, have a lot of ideas that have been tested many, many times and have failed many, many times. And I guess maybe what I can take away from this that I need to think harder about is that maybe the only way out is through, and maybe there does need to be a period of a shakeup and of trying some really bad things that may actually cause some real damage, whether to the economy or people's lives or to democracy. I don't like the idea of rounding up immigrants. I think that could be a catastrophe. But maybe you're right. Maybe the only way out is through. I wanted to mention.
Let me also be clear. I mean, I'm as hostile to Miller and Bannon as you are. I mean, for me, Bannon is just a Leninist on the right, and I'm hostile to Lenin. So I'm not in favor of rounding up immigrants. I just
don't
think
say
that if you have a situation where 10 or 15 million people in your own country are illegal immigrants, it has to be addressed. You can't just ignore it, and then anytime anyone criticizes them, accuse them of being racist or child haters. It's just absurd. And I don't know whether I'm sure you've read The Leopard, but it's a really important book. You should watch the movie, the Visconti movie too, because in some ways what he was writing about, imagining late 19th century Italy, was similar to early 21st century America. For America to stay the same, to keep the qualities, the vitality, the energy, the originality, the uniqueness of America, has to change. And there's this fear of change, which maybe, if I want to be critical of you, I'm not critical of any of your values, but you seem, John, fearful. Why? You've got to take some, and I think this is a feature of your class, this think tank, sort of expert clerisy, whatever you want to call them, a technocratic elite, is that and I don't mean you personally, but your class is so fearful of change. They become so profoundly conservative in the worst sense. They're not willing to take gambles. And meanwhile, Musk is taking $100 billion gambles. He took a $40 billion gamble with X, which he seems to have won. And these guys are running rings around you. So what we need and I consider myself progressive, certainly I think more on the left than you. I don't consider myself a centrist. What we need amongst progressives is a willingness to take risks and recognize that you can't always win. I mean, the cult of failure is one of the ideologies of Silicon Valley. Reid Hoffman, who's one of the founders of the contemporary Democratic Party, wrote a book, I think, arguing that you should fail often and fail fast. The problem is he hasn't imported those values to politics.
Well, long conversation there, which we shouldn't have now. But I will own fear of change in the governmental sphere if it is unmanaged change, if it is chaotic, if it is thoughtless, and if it breaks institutions, which can be very fragile. I agree with you that America's great gift is for change and innovation in the private sector. But the private sector and the US government are very different things with very different missions. And it is very easy to break a national healthcare system if you just
there is no
start pulling chunks out.
national health system in America. That's the problem. Let me ask you one question. I don't want to turn the tables, but I think one of the most interesting writers on America, and I've never made much of an effort, I should try and get him on the show, is Michael Lewis. I mean, I think his book, The Fifth Risk, is really good. It's probably the best book on Trump and Trumpism. And he wrote a series in the Washington Post defending the value of government and finding people in Washington, D.C. who are actually valuable and doing things as opposed to just, useless bureaucrats. I'm curious, what do you think of the need for a Musk to reevaluate the efficiency of the American bureaucracy? You're in Washington, D.C. You must know many, many people who work in government. There's this sort of moving staircase between government and think tanks like Brookings. Is there any need for what, and it'll probably break down into more Farsk and more Muskian or Trumpian nonsense, but is there a need to seriously evaluate the efficiency and functionality of the American state? And might that be a good thing? I know you enjoyed a show with some friends of mine, Jeff Kopstein and Steve Hansen, both very distinguished political scientists. They've written a book about the assault on the state, how the global attack on modern government endangers our future. I think they're onto something, noting that Trump, in a kind of Weberian sense, is a supporter of patrimonialism. I think that's one area where we need to sort of think this thing through critically.
Well, I'm of exactly the same mind on that. I was going to mention the book because it's that episode actually, which alerted me to the book, and now the thinking of Hansen and Kopstein and Max Weber, on which it's based. I think
they're both very serious Weber scholars. Hansen, I saw him a couple of weekends ago because the program we were both studying in Berkeley had its 30th year anniversary. We should actually do a show with you, Hansen, and Kopstein. Be interesting.
Well, I'd love that. I'm in fact planning to write something about patrimonialism because a light bulb went off. We talk about, is Trump authoritarian or is he a dictator, or, what is he? I think actually they've come up with the right answer. He's a classic patrimonialist. This is a very familiar thing, and it's not the same as an authoritarian or a dictator. So I did want to call people's attention to that. The very brief response to what you just said is, we at places like Brookings are all about every day. All we do is come to work and try to think of creative new ways to make things work better. And people can piss on that and say, well, we're all self-serving. But, people have been trying for years with a little bit of success to do things like improve the healthcare system, make it work better. I think Obamacare actually did that. Job retraining, trade adjustment authority, the child tax credit increases, which reduced poverty. the earned income tax credit, on and on. A lot has been done, and I'm proud of that record. That said, should more be done? I have no problem with private sector people coming in and looking at government. I smile a bit because it's been done before. Remember the Grace Commission 40 years ago?
No, of course I
Ronald
don't.
Reagan?
Nobody. You're the
Ronald
only person in the world, John, who remembers that.
I'm showing my age, but Reagan comes in and he says we need to bring private sector dynamism and ideas to government. So he goes out and finds a tycoon named J. Peter Grace, who in his day was kind of a Trump figure, a developer and a businessman, and they put together a commission which they say is going to come up with lots of dynamic changes to government. And what they produce is a damp squib. What's true isn't new in that report, and what's new isn't true, and it's not implementable, and the dollar figures are absurdly small, and it's not scaled to the problem, and everyone shrugs and walks away. And so that may happen again, and the cost of that will be more cynicism, I fear. I want to ask you about San Francisco
Can I
before we
just
get off. Oh
one
yeah,
thing
sure.
that I'm just looking for the piece. There was a really interesting piece. I'm sure you saw it in the New Yorker last month by Nicholas Lehman on. It was entitled "Bidenomics is starting to transform America. Why has no one noticed?" And it spoke of the value of the Biden reforms, which I mean, I think there are two realities here. On the one hand, Bidenomics is real and does seem to be shifting, though it's slow and it will be hard to determine and hard to quantify in the long term.
And Trump will get credit.
Well, yeah, but it works both ways. You know, Biden got credit for some of the stuff that Trump did on COVID. I mean, it's always no one can ever acknowledge that. That's what American politics is. The new administration always takes the credit for what the previous one did or didn't do. But I think there are two things here which are really, really important in terms of figuring out how to reinvent America in the 21st century. The first is that the old models, the New Deal is dead, and the New Deal strategy just doesn't work. I mean, Biden invested whatever it was, trillions of dollars in the economy. He couldn't even articulate it, maybe because he was an old man who shouldn't have been in office, but his advisors couldn't or wouldn't admit it because they couldn't even articulate it. I mean, FDR used to boast about the New Deal. It was his calling card. It was his ideology. It was what made him FDR. Today, it's as if almost the Bidenomics is an attempt to reintroduce the New Deal without even acknowledging that it is the New Deal. So that's problematic. That's a form of nostalgia. That's, again, not being honest. And the other thing, which I think is really important, is that, and this is the core of the Lehman piece, and this sort of disconnect between the culture of Brookings and the culture of America, is you guys are all into data and quantifying everything. And this is what is annoying Lehman and all the Biden people, is they said, well, the world's better, America's better, we've invested all this, and Americans should be grateful and they should be happy, and they're not. But humans are complicated. You know this better than I do, John. Humans are complicated people. That's where conservatives are valuable. Well, that's where the conservative critique of 19th century liberals is important. That conservatives recognize them, and Burke in particular, the complexity of human beings. We're not Benthamite calculating machines. We're not computers. We don't somehow in our own minds or heads or hearts or souls figure out pleasure and pain and then determine whether or not we like a politician or not. We're much more irrational, much more passionate. And I'm not arguing against Brookings, but what I am saying is there's more to politics than expertise, more to politics than just wonkery, more to politics than this kind of prime ministerial quantification in a Pete Buttigieg style. And that's what Trump proves, is you need, going back to Weber, you need some degree of charisma. And the right have figured it out. They've figured out the first move in this new world. The left needs to do so too. So I think The one character who I'm still haven't forgiven for the election is Michelle Obama. I think she should have run for office, whether she liked it or not. She had a moral obligation. She's the only figure who could have defeated Trump because she has his sort of neo monarchical identity. And that's how the system works. So the left needs to recognize that, and needs to recognize that we aren't just computers. So that I think it's a really important. So I'm not suggesting we shut the. I think you guys do a really good job. The problem is that there's nothing beyond you. We need something beyond you.
Well, that statement, I think it's not only true, I think it's humblingly true. If humblingly is
Don't be
a
too humble,
word.
John. That's one thing that you can
Well,
learn.
no, it's
That was a
if
joke. You're
I
supposed to laugh at that.
if I sound my mind somewhere else, if I sound defensive of policy wonk world, which is where I live, of course it's because I am defensive and because we think we've been trying to attack these problems for years, and the very people who stall initiatives that actually would help change some of these things, making a rational worker retraining system, then turn around and, having stalled or blocked the initiatives, blame us for not solving the problem. So I have a sense of injustice about that and the sense of grievance. But setting aside all that, of course you're right. And of course there have to be narratives, there have to be stories, there has to be an overarching theme. And yes, Kamala Harris and the Democrats, and I failed at that. And yes, you're right. You're just right. And that's.
I'm going to put that's going to be the title of this interview, John. Of course, you're right.
We are getting close to wrapping up, but I have been meaning to ask you about San Francisco. It is a city where I did a lot of my growing up. My mother moved to Berkeley when I was 11 or 12 and consorted with people who were eventually in the Symbionese Liberation Army. I'm not sure if
Wow, I
that
didn't
means
know that about
anything
your
to
mother.
you.
I always thought you were in Phoenix,
I was
consorting
in
with
Phoenix part of the time.
future Supreme Court justices.
They got divorced, and my mother moved as far away culturally from Phoenix, Arizona, Goldwater country as you could.
We need an autobiography, John. I think you've got an interesting life.
She established herself in Berkeley and made friends with people who include Kathleen Salias, who was on the FBI's most wanted list for putting a bomb under a police car, and Angela Atwood, who was a SLA member who died in the house fire in 1975. So
Wow.
I
So
knew
no
those
wonder now
people.
you're explaining why you're so fearful of change.
Yeah,
Now you're the
maybe.
conservative. Now I can understand your innate conservatism.
But
Given
I developed in those years a love of San Francisco and the Bay Area as I remembered it, which was down on its heels, but very free, individualistic. It was full of ashrams and head shops, and you could go in the back of a coffee house and actually hear a small scale production of an oratorio by Handel, and very experimental. And now when I go to San Francisco, forgive me, I'm sure this is wrong, but I feel it to be almost a caricature of class divide. Of sort of gilded era where you've got the masters of the universe in Silicon Valley and lining up for the Google bus on Van Ness Street, and then you've got these people who can't afford to live there who
careful,
come in
John.
and
My wife
service the
works for
houses.
Google. She'll
Oh,
be on
sorry.
to you.
And I just, there's this book, San Francisco by Michael Schellenberger, a guy I don't have a lot of time for, but maybe it makes important points. I don't know. What is your take on where you live and what it says about the country?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a subject for, and we could have a whole show on this. I've got two or three thoughts. Firstly, I miss that San Francisco. I mean, my favorite movie is Hitchcock's Vertigo. I'm not sure how familiar you are. One of the great scenes in it is when Jimmy Stewart is about to be tricked. He's seduced by the criminal in the movie, and they're in a shipyard, an imaginary shipyard, is when San Francisco did indeed probably theoretically had shipyards. And the guy points at an old painting of San Francisco in the mid 19th century, in the years of the 49ers, of the gold rush, and said, I miss that San Francisco. That San Francisco has disappeared. And that's always the narrative in San Francisco. Whenever you live there, people are always looking back and always nostalgic for another San Francisco. Maybe in that sense, it's rather like America, always imagining a better time previously, but at the same time, and it comes back to what we were saying earlier, it's also a city on the frontier of change, or making change, both the product and the creator of all the change. I don't think there's so it is a very interesting place, and I'm very fortunate to live in it. But I'm also, the way you described it, I haven't found a cafe where there's an oratorio in the back, because that's gone. That old San Francisco doesn't really exist. Although I live on Ashbury Heights between the Castro and Haight-Ashbury, and out still towards the ocean. There's still the spirit, the energy, the optimism of old San Francisco. You talk about class struggle. I mean, the Marxist class struggle, of course, is between a bourgeoisie and a working class. That's how most people think of class struggle. What's in San Francisco is a more feudal struggle between an elite, property owners, very, very wealthy property owners, and a not a working class, but what Marx would call a lumpen proletariat, a homeless class. Drug addicts, homeless people living in their cars, people not able to make a living for one reason or other, people with a lot of mental illnesses, ex-servicemen. And to me, that in that sense, San Francisco is a warning about what America could become. When America was founded as a reaction against feudalism, when Tocqueville came to America, he didn't, of course, come to California, but when Tocqueville came in the early 19th century, he saw America as an alternative to feudal Europe. San Francisco is feudal in the sense that the dominant class has its own codes, its own dress, its own ideology. But in contrast to feudalism, which wasn't quite as bad, I think, as some Americans think, nobody acknowledges it. So you have this weird situation where I have neighbors, incredibly wealthy neighbors, people with 2 homes in San Francisco and in Sonoma, worth millions, tens of millions of dollars, who put signs for kind of socialist revolutionaries in their windows. So I think in some senses, Schellenberger is right that progressives have ruined San Francisco, but I think San Franciscans are waking up to that and recognizing the profound hypocrisy at the heart of much of San Francisco's politics. But I do think that San Francisco is a warning about what America can become, because the reality is America is feudal. You live in your own realities. Feudal Europe was one where there was no nation state. People coexisted, but they had different clothing, different languages, different ways of behaving. It was an entirely foreign way of living. And the worst sort of post-industrial fate of America is to return to a kind of feudalism, which could happen. The coastal elites and the hinterlander Americas are on the way to that, where, for better or worse, it's a de facto kind of feudalism. And that's why they can't understand one another, because they live in entirely separate worlds. It's always assumed that nation states created understandings. My favorite writer on all this, by the way, I'm not sure if you've read him, is Gellner, Ernest Gellner, a Czech British sociologist, anthropologist, who's written some wonderful books on nationalism. And he argues that the nation state came about because of the way in which the Industrial Revolution brought everybody together. But the post-industrial revolution is separating us. So a lot of Americans scratch their heads and say, why can't we Americans get on? Why can't we, the brave angels, you and I have been to these events. Why can't we all just become Americans again? But the nation state rests on a socioeconomic system that makes Americans. And San Francisco is an example of a place where there is no working class in San Francisco anymore. There are some workers, but they all have to live out of San Francisco because they can't afford the rents here. And they certainly can't afford to buy the houses and the apartments here.
So you said San Francisco is waking up to this. Is there a path out?
Well, the path out, to excuse the pun, is the bridges. And that's what the old working class, they have to get on the bridge and go back to their suburbs. San Francisco can't reinvent the socioeconomic structure of America. They can't. I mean, it's always tried in the past. You can't have an economic revolution in San Francisco because it's part of the United States. So no, San Francisco can't. What is happening, and this is, I think, also what's true about San Francisco, is I think a lot of the, shall we say, the political, the voyeuristic tourism of coming to San Francisco and saying, this is the future, you've got these drug neighborhoods, and this is what all America is going to become, isn't actually true. I mean, San Francisco is actually more functional than it seems from the outside. And there's a lot of vitality, and it's a very nice place to live. And there are pockets of the city that are just catastrophic, that are like sort of tableaus from Bruegel or something, where people are lying in the street, but there's still just pockets. But that's how San Francisco will progress. I mean, the really interesting, and I'm not really answering your question because I don't have the answer, but what might happen in San Francisco is maybe it will become, again, the petri dish, a laboratory for change through AI. Because there are a lot of really smart people, a lot of money in San Francisco, a lot of people committed to trying to figure this thing out. And if there is a city, maybe Los Angeles as well, but if there are places in America where the AI revolution could be used to really fundamentally rethink urban life and all the inequalities and struggles and crises of architectural crises of America at San Francisco. I don't know how it's going to happen. It certainly won't happen with career politicians. And it's interesting that Musk, all the tech bros left. So Musk left, all the others left. Peter Thiel left. I mean, all that's left now is Reid Hoffman. He should run for governor and try and impose his change. Stuff will happen in San Francisco. Don't write it off. I think that people have written it off too soon. But it is a warning. It's both a warning and an opportunity, like America. But it has to change. I mean, it goes back to the leopard. The only way it can stay the same is by changing. And there is good work done. I think, books like Schellenberger's, I agree with you. I don't like his politics. He's a reactionary. It's more complicated than blaming everything on progressives, but they do have a responsibility. I mean, they are part of the problem. I didn't answer your question because I don't really know the answer, but it is interesting. And I think maybe we should have a whole show on it. Maybe get somebody like Schellenberger on.
Well, I'm going to end our show the way you end your show, which is to welcome you back and hope that you will reappear on Keen On. I have some confidence you'll do so. Thank you for a thought-provoking, wide-ranging, interesting, and fun conversation. And I will check out from my seat as guest host, but hope that I might come back as guest.
You've always got open invitation, John, both as host. You've done a great job, and as certainly a guest. And I think when our next round, we'll get Kopstein and Hansen. I think it'll be an interesting conversation. We can really focus down on their analysis of the patrimonial state and what can replace it in the 21st century. So thank you so much. You've been a very generous host, too generous for me, but I appreciate it so much.